This is a recording of a presentation at the Madison Friends Meeting Gathering Forum called Restoring the Kinship Worldview, originally given on April 12th, 2026 by Scott Fulton. In the last talk I gave a few weeks ago, I introduced myself using the traditional Ojibwe protocol in the way that I had been taught. I won't go through that again today, but I did want to return to the beginning of my introduction, and that is this phrase, Anin Indinaway Maganiduk. Anin is the Ojibwe word for greetings or hello, and Indinaway Maganiduk means my relatives. So this is greetings, my relatives. And this phrase represents a very particular worldview that the Ojibwe, as well as virtually all other Native Americans or indigenous people really around the world share. And it's something we're going to explore today, that we are all kin to each other, that we're all relatives, not only human beings, but also the other than human beings with which we share this planet. And this is not a worldview that's shared by everyone, of course, and that's expressed by this little ending on here, idug, which means greetings, my relatives, but I'm assuming that you're my relatives. I'm being a little bit humble about that, and you may not consider yourself to be a relative of me, and I'm okay with that. That's what that idug means. The reason we're doing this presentation today is because of the land acknowledgement minute that the meeting passed about 2 years ago in 2024. And the primary element of this minute is the acknowledgement that the land that the meeting house is on has been occupied since time immemorial by the Ho-Chunk people, occupied and cared for, along with some other tribes who've been here at one time or another. That these people were forcibly removed by the United States government, but are still here with us today, and we acknowledge all of those things. In addition to acknowledging it formally, however, we also agreed to undertake some actions both to educate ourselves more about these indigenous people, as well as to consider taking some other actions. And one of the actions highlighted in yellow there was to consider uh, making a meaningful financial contribution or some other form of reparations to the Ho-Chunk Nation. And in thinking about this, we decided that we needed to do some more education of ourselves before even trying to discern about what we might, if anything, do about reparations. And that's a lot of what we're about here today. So we started this process about a month ago with looking at history and who the people were who lived here before Europeans settled, and in particular, how they interacted with the American settlers, and very specifically, what the interactions were with Quakers. Today, we're going to talk about, as I mentioned, this idea of the kinship worldview. Um, and contrast that with what I will refer to as a dominance worldview that is affecting pretty much everybody on the planet these days. And then on April 26th, we'll come back together for one more gathering forum session where we'll do some worship sharing based on what we have learned in these other two sessions on what we might do for reparations or other kinds of mutual engagement or allyship with the Ho-Chunk Nation and other indigenous people. Now, one of the quotes that was in our land acknowledgement minute, I just think is wonderful, and it's from this woman named Lilla Watson, who is a um, Australian Aborigine activist associated for many, many years with the University of Queensland in Australia. If you're if you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And I think this is a really, really good starting point for especially what we're talking about today. When we looked back at history, I think there's a for some of us, I know for me, there's an overwhelming sense of guilt as white people having in what happened with Native Americans. But it's very, very important for us to think about in moving forward, how might we help each other? And that leaves us open to how might Indigenous people help us. One of the great tragedies, which we also mentioned in the Land Acknowledgement Minute, of our interaction with Native Americans is because European settlers and settlers from elsewhere came here with the idea that they had a way of life and a culture and civilization that these poor indigenous people needed, that they didn't listen or really look for any gifts that those indigenous people could give us. What we're going to talk about today is this notion of worldview and how the indigenous worldview differs from the worldview that we tend to share with each other, and how the indigenous worldview can really help us through the challenges that the world is facing today. So the first question in this consideration is, what do I mean by a worldview? I want to get pretty clear about that before we start. And I like this particular definition here. It's a comprehensive, intellectual, and intuitive conception of the universe, often connected with a specific culture. And when we think about culture, we have to recognize that there are layers to this. The worldview, as well as things like values and our kind of education and personal history, are all things that are hidden inside of our head, in our mind. And those are not visible to others that are around us. The place where this starts to become visible is when our mind takes in information through our senses, and uses our worldview and our values to make decisions about what things we're going to do in response to what we're sensing, and that's our behavior. And it's only that behavior, when that behavior is manifested in the outside material world, that we can begin to understand what might be going on in someone else's mind. So there are layers to this, and we have to recognize that we are only really interacting with each other through the material world. One of the things that's interesting about this is that cultures are very, very good at hiding their own worldview from those people who are members of that culture. And so our worldview is actually something that's even hidden from ourselves. We're basically taught to believe from a really early age, really going back to infancy, that the worldview that is shared by our culture is the way the world actually is. It's the way things always have been and the way things always will be. It's just human nature. Um, but that makes it invisible from us. I love this cartoon that, the fish can't tell that they're in water, and it's the same thing with worldview, that it's around us. It affects everything that we sense and that everything that we do in the world, but it's often really hidden from ourselves. And one of the reason I think it's important for us to consider other worldviews is that it allows us to understand our own worldview, what it does for us and to us, and how it might not be a very complete version of what's actually happening in the world, and may in fact be very destructive for us. So the central idea of what I'm going to be presenting today is that there really, at the end of the day, two primary worldviews existing in the world. There are a lot of subsets of these, but at the end of the day, it's really two things. One is what I call the dominance worldview, which has become completely dominant across the entire globe at this point in time. And the other worldview is the worldview that I'm attributing to Indigenous people, although, as we will see, it is a worldview that's actually shared by quite a few other cultures. And that is what I'm labeling, for the moment anyway, the kinship worldview. Now, before I go on here, I want to just say a little bit about how I'm going to present this. Um, I'm going to be sharing this through the lens of a number of books that I've read over the last several years as I've studied this particular topic at great depth. um, most of these are by Indigenous authors. There has been a virtual explosion in the last decade or two of books about this topic and a lot of other things by Indigenous authors, just wonderful, wonderful things that expose us to this. There are some that are by non-Indigenous authors, but are usually very connected with the Indigenous world and kind of stories of the person's interaction with this particular worldview, which I found also to be quite accurate, quite useful. Um, so one of the things I'll say from the outset, and I'll say this several times, and I'm doing this partly for myself because this is something I have very much struggled with. When I contrast something like the dominance or a kinship worldview, I am not saying that this is a binary, that it's either or. But the best way to view this is a continuum in which we must find balance. So these are kind of two extremes along a spectrum. Unfortunately, I think it's one of the characteristics of the dominance worldview that it tends to view everything as a binary, and that's one of its many problems. But we'll come back to that topic a little bit later. Now, in order to explore this a little further, what I'm going to do is look at this continuum from a lot of different dimensions, sort of different ways of expressing the difference between dominance and kinship. And the first one we'll take a look at here is that the dominance worldview tends to be very anthropocentric, human-centered, humanist. Whereas the kinship worldview tends to be have a much broader view of life and the community of life, and so I would kind of label it to be biocentric, all of life, not just human beings. So to illustrate that, this is kind of a hierarchy of the living things and what we might call non-living things on the planet. And humans are always at the top of that in the anthropocentric worldview or humanist worldview. And then the animals that are closest to us, where our fellow animals would be next down on the list. And then below that would be the plants and, kind of the other living things. And then at the bottom of this are what we would label non-living things, the rocks, the waters of the world, the air, the sun, the moon, etc. We often call those non-living things. Now, in the biocentric worldview, a completely different perspective. This thing is completely turned on its head. The what we would call non-living things, what the dominance worldview would call non-living things, are at the top because they're the oldest and they can survive and thrive without any of the other things that are below them. They've been doing it for billions of years, and but they are still viewed as being alive. Rocks and waters and air and the sun and the moon are all considered to be living systems. They just have much longer time frames than what we're used to. And then the plants would be next from the top because while they require the water and the soil and all and the sun and all that in order to live, they don't really require the animals or the human beings to do so. And then the animals are down below that because they need both the sun and the water and the soil, but they also need the plants. And then we're at the very bottom. Human beings are the last to be created and they're dependent on absolutely everything else. So they're really pretty helpless, and without the help from all of the other beings, they have no chance of surviving. And so that's kind of the indigenous view of the world. As you can see, it's just completely the opposite of the way we've been brought up to think of ourselves in the world. But in my mind, it really makes quite a bit of sense. Now, similarly, another way of kind of looking at same thing and maybe a little more expansive view is the notion of a hierarchical organization of beings or community versus a network. Um, and so, in our dominance worldview, this is all about hierarchy and where you are in the hierarchy. The people above you are dominating you, they're controlling your behavior, controlling your access to resources, and those things below you are things that you can use for resources and that you dominate. And this is an idea that goes back a long ways. It was really first articulated clearly, as far as I know, by Aristotle. It was elaborated at great length in the Middle Ages with the church, because um, it was called the Great Chain of Being. God was at the top of it, and then the angels and the archangels, and then you have people, and people are in, of course, a tremendous hierarchy based on race, class, culture, gender. Women are always placed below men, children below women, etc. And then the animals, the same thing. They're higher animals and lower animals. The plants are down near the bottom. And then all the rocks and soil and water is just stuff we use to do our stuff. That's stuff that we pretty much ignore. The Indigenous side of this would be looking at this as a web, as a network community in which all the members have a role to play. They're all interconnected with everything else. No one is above anything else. Everyone's important. Everyone plays a part. So this is just diametrically opposed from the hierarchical perspective, and it's very, very much an important factor in the way Indigenous people think about things. So now that I think we're getting maybe a little bit of an idea of what I mean by dominance versus kinship, I want to look at a little bit different side of this. And the starting point for this was an enormous and very, very interesting book called The Dawn of Everything. It was written by David Graeber and David Wengro. It was published, I think, in 2021. They are not indigenous. I think they're both British. David Graeber is well known for being one of the founders of the Occupy Wall Street movement, but he's actually was an anthropologist. He died just before this book was published, actually. And Wengro is an archaeologist. And basically, they're looking at the entire history of humanity using the latest evidence from both archaeology and anthropology, things really all stuff in the 21st century. And exploring the idea that this dominance worldview, which really has come to dominate all human thinking on the planet, was not the only possible outcome. That there was a lot of experimentation, a lot of different things tried, and that a lot of the stories that we have learned about how things unfolded for humanity and why they went in a particular direction are just simply not true based on the most recent evidence that we have from what happened 10, 20,000 years ago. But what I wanted to bring out here was a kind of a contrast that they point out. One of the major points in this book is that indigenous people generally assume that there are three primordial fundamental freedoms that human beings really share or should share. And these are really, really interesting. One is that you have a complete freedom to disobey orders. The second is you have a freedom to move to a different place if you don't like what's going on where you are. And the third is you have a freedom to create or transform the social relationships that you're involved in. Um, Now, these, for those of us who were raised in the dominance culture, particularly the first one, it tends to give people like, what? Because we're really taught to believe that we have to be dominated in order to have a functioning society. And what the Indigenous worldview is saying, no, as a human being, if you're not free to disobey orders, you're a slave, and there's no getting around that. So, really, really interesting thing to think about. Where I, I think it's really important to point out, however, that this freedom comes with a responsibility to contribute to the community, and we will return to that theme a little bit later. But this is something really interesting to think about because it's not what certainly I would have expected when I first started to think about these things. Now, this is a book that was just published very recently. It won the Pulitzer Prize in history last year. It's by Kathleen Duval. She's not an Indigenous person, but she used almost entirely Indigenous sources for this. She's a historian at the University of North Carolina. She was actually featured quite prominently in Ken Burns' recent film about the American Revolution. That's her primary field. But this is looking at a set of about half a dozen or so different indigenous nations from across North America, Turtle Island, um, over a span of years, about 1,000 years up to the present. So this is spanning the time before Europeans began to arrive and settle here to the present. And one of the things she points out in here and explores at considerable length is really, really interesting that the indigenous people of North America were starting to go down the same pathway of adopting this dominance worldview and dominance culture that has kind of infected the rest of the planet. But they consciously turned away from it, and she explores why that happened and really provides a lot of documentation that it did happen repeatedly across the continent. Um, and so they began to actually go back to what were for them the sort of old ways of relationship and kinship. And they developed, even though there were hundreds and hundreds of different languages and nations and life ways, um, and they certainly had a lot of interaction with each other, but they developed this kind of common worldview that thrived over many centuries across these different cultures, and even persisted across all of the persecution of the removal and assimilation eras that we talked about in the last presentation, and is now still with us and being expressed in a very important way. So very, very interesting set of ideas here. So one of the three primordial freedoms that I mentioned was the ability to remake social relationships. And some of you are probably aware that most indigenous cultures were very tolerant and, in fact, even quite respectful of people who had different gender orientations or sexual preferences. You may have heard the term two spirit, which is actually a pretty recent coinage to express this idea. But it's a very real idea. This is a book called Fur Trade Nation that's kind of fascinating. It's again a Ojibwe, and it's talking about the fur trade era, particularly with the French, which started in the early 1600s and continued through kind of the mid 1800s. And it's told in this sort of graphic, almost comic book style, as you see here, but it's a real serious piece of history. And one of the things I ran across in this book that really tickled me was this person, Yellowhead. Her Ojibwe name was Ozawandi, and she was born in the late 1700s and lived through the mid 1800s. She was the offspring of a very prominent Ojibwe war chief and was born a boy, but fairly early in life decided that she was really a woman and dressed as a woman and behaved as a woman. Although she did maintain her role, she was a very skilled warrior and maintained that role throughout her life, which is a little unusual. Um, She got into the historical record for a couple of reasons. One was there was a gentleman named John Tanner who was raised by Indigenous people in Ohio and then later in life kind of rejoined white society. And a very famous memoir was written about him that was a very popular book at the time. And it mentions that Yellowhead or Ozawandib actually proposed to John Tanner, and he turned her down, unfortunately. But and that was recorded in this memoir, so this is part of the historical record. Um, Personally, Ozawandib or Yellowhead, it's kind of come into my life because she lived on Star Island in Cass Lake, which, as I mentioned in the last presentation, is a place where my family, this is up in north central Minnesota. It's where my family has had a summer cabin for the last 80 years, so it's been a big part of my life. And for a long time, the Cass Lake, the lake that this island is on, was designated to be the headwaters of the Mississippi, and that was important because that was the point by treaty that was the intersection between the American, British, and French parts of North America for quite a long time. But it actually was known that it was not the real headwaters, and in 1832, a guy named Henry Schoolcraft decided to go find the headwaters. And because he had married an Ojibwe woman and was fluent in the language, he went up to Star Island and met Ozawandib there. And she showed him where the headwaters actually were. It's what's now called Lake Itasca. And so she came into the history books for that. Um, there is now on the island a very beautiful little canoe campground on the north shore of the island called the Yellowhead Campground. And that's where my father gave my mother her engagement ring. So, a very famous place in our family. And it was always my mother's favorite place on the entire island. And so it was the appropriate place to spread her ashes in this place that's associated with this famous transgender woman. And my I have a transgender daughter myself, and as you can imagine, this whole story collectively is extremely meaningful to her. So the next aspect of this I'd like to look at is how the Indigenous or kinship worldview looks at criminal justice. And this is done through sort of a little different way of looking at things. This is a book called The Peacekeeper, which I know a few people in the meeting have read. This is actually not a fancy philosophical text. This is actually a kind of a science fiction murder mystery. And I have to say that I've gotten a lot of really interesting insight to Indigenous worldview from the vast amounts of both literature, film, artwork, etc., that are being produced by Indigenous creatives these days. Remember that worldview is at least in part intuitive. It's not all an intellectual exercise. So I won't give any spoilers about this book, but one of the things it focuses on as a murder mystery is not only how is the mystery resolved, but how is it dealt with in the criminal justice system. And in our criminal justice system, of course, the primary focus is to um, seek justice, but what that really means when it really comes down to it is punishment or really vengeance on the person who perpetrated the crime on behalf of the victims. In the indigenous worldview, the kinship worldview, the primary focus of this whole system is not to punish anybody. It's to restore balance to the community. The crime has disrupted that balance, and the idea is to figure out how to restore balance. And there is an expectation that the perpetrator will participate in helping to restore that balance, in particular with reparations to the victims. So, something to think about when we think about reparations ourselves. And that crime is ultimately prevented not by the threat of punishment, but by the community redoubling its effort to teach everyone through how they're raised and through the culture that they maintain how to be a good human and how to be a good participant in the community. That's the way to really prevent crime, if you will. So very, very different. This is very much along the idea of what some of us would call restorative justice, something of I know a lot of interest to a number of people in the meeting. And what's interesting about this book is it explores this in some detail with a real kind of very engaging case. Um, but it shows not only the benefits of restorative justice, but also some of the challenges that it faces. There is no perfect justice system, and it's not an either or. You need to have a mixture of what we think of and this idea of restorative justice as well. So we've looked at a lot of different facets of this. We started with the idea of dominance versus kinship. We looked at anthropocentric versus biocentric, kind of another way of looking at it. The idea of hierarchy versus a network or a web of relationships. We've looked at the idea of rights or freedoms versus responsibilities. This is a little different than what I talked about, but I think that this is the right balance, that in the dominance culture, rights are kind of a way of protecting individuals from the dominance of the government. And in the kinship worldview, it would be very much focused around what are your responsibilities as a member of the community. The criminal justice system we just mentioned, the idea of punishment over restoration of balance of the community. And I didn't speak about this, but there is also another way of expressing all of this, I think, is in dominance, there's how do you have power over others in the hierarchy versus having power with others in this web of relationships. Um, so that's kind of a summary of where we are now. Now I want to look at a little bit different side of this and maybe add a dimension to our thinking. So my starting point for this next section was starting to think about how might this worldview affect science and how we view the physical and biological world. We've focused so far on kind of social, political aspects of this, but if this is a full worldview, a full conception of the universe, it must have some scientific implications. And this is a pretty big deal for me. In my background, I majored as an undergraduate in physics and biology, and worked in the biotech field for my career. And I've long been fascinated by the interrelationships between philosophy and scientific thought, as well as my own spirituality. So this particular book really was a game changer for me. It was written by a British physicist who moved to North America, to Canada actually, and began interacting with a variety of indigenous people and began to see how the emerging changes in science in the last 50 years or so are related to the indigenous worldview and how he experienced that. It's a really, really fascinating book called Blackfoot Physics. And I think his fundamental thing here is that there's a tremendous value and new understanding to be gained through a dialogue between these worldviews with an open mind and heart. And I won't go into this because it's a bit of a black hole for me. I am totally fascinated by this stuff, so I'm going to refrain as much as possible. But there are a lot of recent developments in the last few decades and unsolved issues in physics, biology, ecology, etc., that have really called into question for me and many, many other scientists um, our attachment to this firm analytical or fragmentation mindset. And this is kind of what I would like to explore next. So I see this as a different dimension of this continuum. And on the one side, kind of related to the dominance worldview, is the notion that we understand the world by breaking it into fragments, that we're looking for the atoms, the cells, the fundamental building blocks of the world, of the universe. And the idea that if we understand those fundamental building blocks, then we understand the totality of everything. And for the last 500 years, that has been the primary tool of science, to break the world down into smaller parts, to study those in great detail with the idea that that will help us understand everything else. On the other side of this continuum is the notion of wholeness, that the totality of something, including all of its aspects, its own individual history, etc., but the totality of everything in the world is actually far greater than what's created by the fragments. And just to give you an example of what I mean by that, if you think about a beautiful painting by, say, Rembrandt, um, the fragmentation worldview would say, well, if I break that down into its parts and study the detailed chemical composition and spectrographic analysis of all of the pigments and the canvas, that is the key to understanding this Rembrandt painting. And the more I understand about those fundamental building blocks, the better off I am. I think you can plainly see that no, that doesn't really tell you anything about the Rembrandt painting. The painting is in its wholeness and understanding everything about what's in the picture, everything you can understand about the context of Rembrandt's life, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's the kind of the difference that we're talking about here. Another aspect of this is this notion that I've already mentioned between dualism of saying things are binaries, right and wrong, true or false, black or white, male or female, et cetera, et cetera. And that on the one side, we tend to break things into these binary dualisms, say that one is good and one is evil. The other way of looking at things is that these are spectrums and that they're complementary to each other. It's kind of like the yin and yang idea in Chinese thought. Um, that and so you can move back and forth, and your idea is to find the balance appropriate to a particular situation. So that's another element of this. There's also, and we've kind of touched on this already in the other side, but I think it also fits into this dimension, is the idea of your defining the world by its boundaries versus defining the world by its interconnections. And all of these are kind of aspects. I will label this in general fragmentation versus wholeness, but we'll look at some of the other aspects of this particular dimension. So one kind of native viewpoint on this is a book. It's about 25 years old, but it's a wonderful book by Gregory Cayete, who's a from Laguna Pueblo in New Mexico, and it's looking at native thinking as science, and understanding how indigenous people understood and understand the world using this kinship worldview and this worldview of wholeness. And so this idea that everything is created from relationships with places and between beings, and that almost everything in the world is living and has some sort of agency. And that we're a dependent part of that community, and as human beings, we need to be learn to be humble, respectful, and responsible members. Another element that he brings out really well is this idea that much of what happens in the world is through dynamic, interconnected, interwoven processes with things happening, as opposed to objects, which is what we tend to focus on in the dominance or fragmentation worldview. And this is reflected in many, many, if not most, Native American languages. Most of the words are verbs. They're not nouns, they're verbs. And that just reflects this focus on processes. Now, another view of this from the point of view of ecology and biology is a book I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. If you're not familiar with this book, I highly, highly recommend it. She also has a number of wonderful videos that you can find on YouTube, kind of expressing the same ideas. She's just an amazing person. And this is kind of looking at this from a biological or ecological perspective, and very contemporary. And a lot of what she has to say is about acknowledging and having gratitude for all of these reciprocal relationships that we have with everything in the world. That this is just an amazing thing to be in, but that you need to really be pretty humble about it. Another big, big theme for her, especially in this book, is that the way to really understand the world is not through focusing on one side of this equation or another, but by exploring the interactions between the different worldviews. So her background is actually in formal biology. She got her master's degree at UW-Madison. And she was a noted biologist of mosses, was kind of her original field, and she's now a really prominent plant ecologist. So she has a very strong, standard scientific ecological knowledge, but she combines that with what is come to be called traditional ecological knowledge arising from this kinship worldview, and that putting those two together is what gives you a really much more complete understanding of really anything to do with the world around us. So I came at this other dimension sort of through the vision of science, but Robin Wall Kimmerer just last year published this other wonderful book. It's quite short, but it's about economics. And she admits freely she's not an economist, but I think she has something extremely important to say. Again, I know a lot of you have seen this book, and if you haven't read it, it's just wonderful. Um, the economic system that we have, we've kind of gone all in on capitalism, which is based on the idea of individuals pursuing their own personal or family economic interests and kind of maximizing their personal gain. And part of this is the idea of net worth being the amount of stuff and money that you have personally accumulated that you haven't used yet, which is kind of a weird idea, actually. But if you step back from economy and say, what is an economy? It's really supposed to be how we allocate human labor and the resources that are made available to us in order to meet everyone's needs in the community that we live in. Not only for ourselves, but for everybody else in that community. That's what the economy is really all about, is that allocation process. And what she talks about here is the economy that arises from the wholeness kinship worldview that she calls a gift economy, and that's a common term that's used among Indigenous thinkers. And it assumes abundance in the world, and it assumes that people and others who are participating in this economy, which includes all of the living beings that we share the world with, that there's universal reciprocity, that I give back when I take something. And this flips the idea of capitalism on its head. It doesn't say your worth is based on what you've accumulated, but really on what you're contributing to the community. And that a fundamental thing that makes this work is continuous gratitude. So just to give you an example of how this might work in the natural world, she uses the serviceberry as an example. This is a kind of small bush or tree that produces a huge profusion of really tasty berries. They're a little bit like a cross between a blueberry and an apple. And um, in the natural world, this is one of the first plants in the forest to flower in May. And so insects like bumblebees that are early emerging are really dependent on it for pollen and nectar in order to be able to live. And so in exchange for that, they spread the pollen around and ensure that the serviceberry gets maximum biological diversity and can evolve to meet the requirements of the moment. And then later in the season, it produces this profusion of berries, which are a huge resource, not only for people, have been for many, many centuries, millennia really, but also all of the animals, especially birds, really chow down on these things. And what the serviceberry gets out of that, of course, is they're also, with the berry, they're eating the seeds. And so they move around the landscape and poop out the seeds and spread the service berries around. So everybody's getting something that they need out of this in complete reciprocity, and it really comes along very nicely. If you apply that in the human world, a way to think about this is, say I am working with my neighbor on our shared garden. And in that, I planted a serviceberry, and I collect the berries and make a couple of berry pies one of which I share with my neighbor for the work that she's put in with me to help on the garden, and she takes it home and shares it with her family and becomes so enamored of all of the wonderful food in her life and so grateful for that she decides to finally go out and volunteer at the local food pantry and pass that abundance along. So that's kind of a notion of what this really means. Now, if you think about this, it seems very idealistic. It doesn't seem like the real world. But I would like to point out that I'm serving at the moment on our How Meeting Works committee, and we're getting ready now to share some of our findings with the meeting and begin to discuss next steps. And in a recent meeting that we had, I brought up this idea of a gift economy and that this is really kind of how the meeting actually works in practice. And everybody else on the committee just thought that that actually captures exactly the way the economy of the meeting works, how we share our labor and resources, including money, to meet the needs of everyone in the community itself and help everyone to thrive. And so I think this is a fundamentally important idea to think about. So we've now explored this other dimension of this difference between the worldviews, starting with the idea of fragmentation versus wholeness, the idea of kind of binary dualisms, right, wrong, good, evil, etc., versus the continuum, the yin yang complementarity of these notions. Um, the idea of boundaries versus interconnections, also very, very important. We talked a little bit about focusing on objects in the world versus focusing on the interconnected processes, the things that are happening, nouns versus verbs, if you will. Um, Another aspect I didn't really touch on, but it goes along with this, is the notion of absolute truth versus truth being something that's multifaceted and somewhat mysterious. There's always mystery in the world, and we're never going to get at the absolute complete truth. And then finally, a notion of focusing on the needs of the individual, particularly economic needs, and kind of doing everything for myself versus focusing on the community. So to end up here, I'd like to turn to a book that is not Indigenous. This is a book called Active Hope by Joanna Macy and her partner Chris Johnstone in the writing of this book. Joanna Macy, I think a lot of you know about. She actually died last summer in her early 90s. She was a Tibetan Buddhist. She's American, but she became a real Buddhist in the Tibetan kind of framework, but was also highly trained as a system theoretician, and later in life became what would be called a deep ecologist, and focused a lot of her life on helping people to begin thinking about what she and others have referred to as the Great Turning. And the idea of this is that in the kind of crisis, accelerating crisis, what I've seen referred to as the time place of collapse that we find ourselves in today, you have three different responses that you can have. One is to go about your business as usual, basically to ignore the problem. We all do that sometimes. Another is to say, this is all falling apart. There's nothing I can do about it. And, this is going to be really bad. And I think we all succumb to that sometimes. What she is a proponent was a proponent of, and many are now, is this notion that this is an opportunity for humanity to change our consciousness and to begin really changing how we interact with each other and with the world, and what is referred to as the Great Turning. Now, the practices involved in this, that she lays out in this particular book and elsewhere, is to start with gratitude. Actually, she starts with breathing, which is a very Buddhist way of thinking about things. But once you're getting into a meditative state, to start with gratitude for the things in your life that you are grateful for. The next step is to begin to honor the pain that you're having and that the pain that you are seeing out in the world around you. And that may seem like a really weird thing to do in order to become hopeful, but if you don't face the suffering in the world and process it, and you're not going to be connected with everyone else in the world because everybody is suffering in some way. So this is a really, really important thing to learn how to do. And she has in this book a lot of ways of thinking about how to do this without just becoming totally overwhelmed with grief. And then there's a process of seeing the world with new eyes. I'll talk about that in a second here, what that means, and then going forth to actually do things. And this is viewed as kind of a cycle. Once you've actually gone out to do things, you need to come back and be grateful for what you've achieved and continue the process. And that's really what this great turning is about. So the idea of seeing with new eyes, part of this is having a wider sense of yourself. And a lot of that is understanding this interconnection, kinship, relationship with the rest of humanity, as well as the rest of all of the other living beings in the world. And so, very, very much aligned with the kinship worldview. Similarly, a much richer experience of what community brings to us, that we're not in this by ourselves, that we are a group, we are a team, and that those communities that we experience directly locally are interconnected in a vast web that extends out over the entire world. So things that we do have implications and ramifications that go way, way beyond us. Another thing she talks about quite a bit is this notion of power with in your community versus power over, which is the idea of dominance. So this is another way of looking at the dominance kinship worldview, and a really very, very powerful thing because when we understand that we are with others, we don't have to do it all by ourselves. Whereas when you're exerting power over others, that really is kind of what you have to do. And then the last part of this is really interesting is to realize that it's not just a global connected community in the present, but that we are part of a community that goes back in time and also goes forward in time. We have ancestors and we have descendants. And I'd like to illustrate that now with an interesting word from the Ojibwe language. So this word is one of my favorites that I learned in studying Ojibwe a little bit. It's pronounced Anakubijigan. Anakubijigan. I love the way it rolls off the tongue. And this is from a root word in Ojibwe, Anakubid, that means to string together or extend something by tying things together. So kind of stringing stuff out. And one of its meanings is just simply an ancestor. So this is a generic word for ancestor, and you can see how that's kind of connected to the idea of tying things together. You're tied back to your ancestor. Your ancestor is tied back to you, I should say. But this also has two other more specific meanings. One is specifically, it means a great grandparent. So it's not just any ancestor, it's specifically your great grandparent. And a reason that that's significant is if you kind of think about it, most of us know our parents, of course, and most of us know our grandparents. Great grandparent is about as far back as most human beings actually have a personal relationship with. And so this is really kind of as far back in time as you can go. What's interesting about Anakubijigun, however, is it also means a great grandchild. So that's the farthest in terms of your descendants that you are likely to actually meet. And so if we put all this together, this word Anakubijigun has going all the way from your great grandparents who might have met you at some point to your great grandchildren who you might meet at some point. And if we look at that, that's seven generations from me and six generations back and six generations forward. And so a lot of you, I'm sure, have heard of the idea of making decisions based on the needs of seven generations. It's about 150 to 200 years, roughly, and that's kind of where this comes from. This notion, and this not only has this idea of really extending our perspective of time. I mean, 200 years of time is a lot to be thinking about in terms of people that actually might have connected relations to you. It's a really, really powerful concept. So the last part of this act of hope is going forth into the world, and one of the things Joanna Macy has talked about quite a bit is that there are three fundamentally but interrelated ways that we go forth into the world and take action, and they're all important And all of us are at one time or another more attracted and more comfortable with different parts of these than others. And that's absolutely fine. That's what's really needed. So one way of going forth is what she calls holding actions. This is basically protecting what we know to be essential and trying to limit the damage when you're in a time of horrible change like we're in right now, kind of time place of collapse. And I think a lot of us are very focused on that these days. We're trying to recover from the massive assault on our democracy and our social structure, et cetera, as well as all of the horrible things that are happening out in the ecological world. So that's really, really important. But you also need to begin to build what is coming next. Because the idea of the turning point is that something will replace what is collapsing now. And so other people, in addition to just holding on to protecting what we can, they need to begin to think about designing and building what is going to come next and what kinds of practices are going to be needed to bring that about. And then the third part, equally important, is shift in consciousness, that we need to change the way we think about the world, our thinking and our values. And all of these things need to go on. For me personally, I would say that for much of my life, I was very focused on new systems and practices. I've always been kind of a creative that way. Now that I'm more of an elder, I am much more focused on the shift in consciousness, which is why I'm jabbering on today about worldviews. But all of these things are important, and we need to move toward the things that are bringing us energy and in which we have skills and gifts. And that's really her point here. So I'll close the presentation today with this I think, fairly well-known symbol of the medicine wheel. This is something that appears in a lot of cultures, but it's very, very prevalent in Native American cultures as a symbol used in artwork, on clothing, and um, other types of objects. The Plains Indians actually build medicine wheels on the ground out of stone, arranging a large circle with a cross of stone through the middle of it. And these are used for ceremonial purposes and for personal spiritual practices. The four quadrants are intended to represent four different aspects of what you wish to contemplate using the medicine wheel. They can be used for many, many different purposes. But you very often see these days in these four specific colors, white, black, red, and yellow. And if you ask an Indigenous person what that means, they will usually tell you that these are intended to represent the four major branches of humanity. The white being the Europeans, the black being the traditional African cultures, kind of prior to colonization, the red being the indigenous people of North America and the Pacific Islands, and the yellow being Asian. And um, the reason for thinking about this in this modern era is that there's a widespread perception among indigenous people that the world desperately needs to have all four of these branches of humanity return to being in balance with each other and really uniting to become a united humanity. That's a prophecy that is spoken of in a number of different indigenous cultures, and it's something that is very, very important to people, which is why you see this symbol so often. Um, I began to think about this in the context of what we've been talking about today, which is this um, different worldviews that these four different branches of humanity have. And as we've talked about today, there really are sort of two different dimensions to this. There's the dominance versus kinship, our political and social organization, and then the fragmentation versus wholeness continuum, which represents kind of the way we think about being in general. Um, and so I kind of will leave you with this picture of this as this two-dimensional space, and suggest kind of the major point I've been trying to make is that the rise of the European culture and through the mechanisms of colonization and the rise of scientific technology driven by the fragmentation component of this, we have gotten way, way out of balance, and that this is giving rise to the kind of social and ecological collapse, economic collapse that we're experiencing now. And that really, I think the indigenous people are correct. We need to pull ourselves back into balance. Um, it is interesting to contemplate, do these four branches of humanity actually represent the space that I'm kind of showing here? I think it is fair to say that the Europeans are very much oriented toward dominance and fragmentation, and that the indigenous uh, people, Native Americans in particular, are focused toward wholeness and kinship. What I know of Asian cultures, which is a fair amount, I think they do have subscribed very much to dominance, just like Europeans. But if you look at the philosophies and spiritual practices of like Buddhism and Taoism and even Hinduism, they really do represent a very strong view of wholeness. I don't know enough about traditional African cultures to say if this model fits, and I don't think at the end of the day it's all that important. That what is important is that we are at a really critical time, and the turning point that Joanna Macy talks about is a process of bringing ourselves back into this center of this space, and really reuniting humanity with the rest of the community of the world, um, so that we can have a thriving future together. So I'll leave you, as any good Quaker would, with a couple of queries for thought. Um, One I think is very, very powerful. It's a challenge, but is what kind of world do you envision for your descendants 7 generations from now? So think 200 years from now. It's hard to even think about 200 years from now. Very, very difficult for us to do that, but I think it's really important. There will be descendants. And what do we want them? What kind of world do we want them to be in? And the second query is how can restoring the kinship wholeness worldview to bring balance back into our worldview as humanity enable us collectively to be good ancestors who help bring about the things we envision for our descendants. So thank you very much for your consideration and appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today.